When we look at the future of life, there's another part of this, the future of society. How that's working. Can you break that down for us, Nick?
Absolutely. The first bit that we want to look at here is what we're terming a climate of change. And here we're looking at the concept and the construct of climate change and how Americans actually view this topic. And the first thing we were looking at is whether or not they even view this as a real problem today. And we did find that the majority of Americans, in fact 66%, agree that climate change is a problem for the world today. And a further 63% also agreed that climate change is caused by humans. So to some degree, there is consensus amongst the American population on some of these topics. However, there are some significant differences by political ideology, and that has a major bearing on some of these results.
So this is looking between those that have got a liberal mindset versus a conservative mindset.
Yeah, so earlier in the study, we asked people what their political views were, whether they were from very conservative to conservative, middle of the road, moderate, or liberal, very liberal. And so here we're looking at those that identify as liberal, very liberal versus conservative and very conservative. And on the topic of climate change being a real problem for the world, 84% of Americans who identify as liberal believe that climate change is a real problem. But that drops down to only 50% amongst conservatives. So it's still almost half of conservatives are there. It's almost at a tipping point in terms of their belief that climate change is a real problem, but it is significantly lower than liberals.
One of the subjects I speak about, and I've worked with the United Nations, and I travel around, I speak to people that work in the oil fields, people that work in fossil fuels, is that recognition that it is real, that people do want to change, and that there's something really interesting to look at. If you go online, you're actually seeing a lot of buzz. It's called hashtag climate brawl. It's like a fist fight, because now what we have is we've got people that are passionate, that want to change the world, and we've got the lobbyists and the bots and all of the people that are still pushing this agenda of, no, we need to keep pumping the oil. We still need to have that to run the economy. So it's become very tense.
Well, this is the interesting thing, I think, in the data too, is, a lot of what you can experience looking at what's going on is that Americans are horribly divided on this topic. And while there are some divisions in the data, the majority of Americans in total actually agree on this topic, that climate change is real and that it's caused by human beings.
And I think that there's a huge opportunity for these traditional energy companies, the companies that deal in fossil fuels, to switch to this new world. And I think that if they get behind insights like this and realize that they can still be the good companies and they can still be an incredibly valuable part of the economy and make a lot of money by providing energy in renewable senses, then I think we're going to end up in a better world.
Well, they may need to, because
Yeah.
I think as you look at the conservative voters in particular, or people who identify as conservative here, when 50% of them already agree that climate change is a big problem, that's the ground at which now you can start seeing political parties of both ends of the spectrum coming together and potentially wanting to move forward with action, because ultimately they have to respond to the needs of their voters.
Yeah, I certainly hope so, because I think the planet needs it. I think we need it. Our families need it as well. So when we looked at climate change, we looked at the energy sources behind what could be causing that as well. What did we find there?
The first thing we looked at was the sense to which people agreed that non-renewable energy was contributing to climate change. But then we're also looking for solutions on what they wanted in order to combat that. And what we found, again, the majority of Americans, 56%, did believe that non-renewable energy, for example, gas or coal, contribute to climate change. But there was a difference still, again, by political ideology there, with a majority of liberals, 73%, but then a minority of conservatives below that 50% agreeing.
So we know that climate change is a real problem. But what about the energy sources that go into that whole discussion?
One of the things that we explored in the study was people's perceptions on their sources of energy. And while the majority of Americans don't want necessarily the government to step in there with laws and limits around it, the majority of them did say that people should use renewable energy for their energy source in order to combat climate change. So there we're talking about particularly solar and wind.
And people want the choice, but people are expecting other people to step forward and make that choice themselves versus the government mandating to them, right?
Well, I think that's an important part of American culture a lot of the time, is a sense of individual will and determination and choice. And while they're recognizing there's a problem there, what they're saying is we want to be able to solve this by choosing renewable energy. And it then becomes incumbent upon industry to provide that option to people. If this is what the average American wants, 62% of them saying that they want renewable energy to combat climate change, then why isn't it available?
And what's really interesting and what I'm seeing globally is that there's a shift away from the people that produce the energy and deliver the energy to the utilities that can distribute that in an efficient way. And there are people talking about global supergrids. We're probably a long way out from a global interconnected renewable supergrid, probably 2050, 2060. But we're already seeing it happen. There's cables being laid right now from Australia to Singapore to provide renewable energy. There's a 5-nation Asian supergrid going into place between like China and Russia and other countries. And we're also seeing in the North Sea out towards Europe, countries like Norway and the UK and others coming together to distribute that wind-generated renewable energy as well. So we also looked at the vehicles that we drive, and especially around fossil fuel vehicles. What did we find there?
Here we found that the majority of Americans agree that fossil fuel vehicles, for example, diesel and gasoline vehicles, in fact do contribute to climate change. What was interesting though is when we were asking them what they could do about that, and one of the options was that people should stop driving fossil fuel vehicles. And almost a third, so only 35% of Americans would agree to that. But we did see some really big differences by age here. So almost 42% of younger Americans, 16 to 29, believe that people should stop driving fossil fuel vehicles to reduce climate change, versus only 23% of those 60 plus.
Yeah, and what's ironic about that is that the younger kids may not even own a vehicle, and they might aspire to own an electric vehicle, but they won't. But the people that I'm talking to out there in America that are owning these electric vehicles are much older, right? Even over 60 years old, because they've got the spare money to be able to buy it. So it's really interesting to see that there's this aspiration, and the people, whilst they're a smaller percentage of the population that wants to change, are actually stepping forward and hopping into electric vehicles going forward. So that's the future of life in America. So where can we find more information?
If people are interested in looking at the data or some of these findings in more detail, they can go to intentions.co.
And do come across to nikolasbadminton.com, where I talk about this and many other things about how life is changing as a whole.